everybody. Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Thanks very much for being with us today for what I think is going to be a really important conversation. We are going to be talking about misinformation. Specifically, the title of this webinar is Battling Misinformation, How to Fight Back Against Fake News. This is a phrase that many of you may not be super familiar with or weren't just a couple years ago, but it's something that's become something of an obsession for our presenter today. Craig Silverman is the media editor at BuzzFeed News. He's also a man that's been credited with coining that phrase, fake news, that you now see a lot coming out of Twitter and the Oval Office and elsewhere. And he may be the world's, or certainly our nation's, foremost expert on online misinformation that's happening today. How do I know this? Well, among other things, he was named just last year as one of Politico's 50, to list of 50 people whose ideas are reshaping our country's politics. And they've acknowledged what a profound influence his observations and notes and reporting have been. He's going to join us today to share his expertise and explain how online misinformation spreads, what you can do about it, that's critical, what you can do about it, and how to stay trustworthy and maintain your organization's credibility in these days of having a hard time of figuring out what's real and what's not. So over the next hour, we're going to cover quite a lot of ground, but among those things we're going to talk about are what drives the misinformation ecosystem? How do these things move about the web so quickly and become so powerful? How communicators can help navigate this new confusing world that we find ourselves in, and how you can verify content and create trust with digital audiences, so people that you don't know but that may be talking to you on a regular basis or checking in to see what you're doing. Now, a couple of logistical items, and I'm going to hand it over to Craig. We are, as we always do, we'll be taking questions throughout the presentation. To do that, if you're a first-time user, if you look in the lower left-hand corner of the technology, the software here, you can see a chat box. You'll just type your questions in there, and at a couple points along the way, we will stop and take your questions. You can also engage with us on Twitter. That's not fake news. Sorry, I had to do that, guys. If you use the hashtag ComNetLive, that's COMNETLIVE, if you type your questions or comments in there, we'll be taking notes along the way. Happy to keep an eye on those. And as always, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll post it up online at comnetwork.org for free replays in the next week or two. So thanks again for joining us. I think we've all got a lot to learn. I've had the great pleasure of seeing this presentation. Craig gave it down at the Night the Foundation's Media Forum in Miami not so long ago, and he was kind enough to agree to give it to all of us. Now, you're in for a real treat. So with that, why don't I hand it off to Craig. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be able to hopefully share some useful and interesting information with you. So let's take a look at what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to go through a few different things. So looking at the different types of online misinformation that are out there, you've probably heard the term fake news. It's a term that's kind of become weaponized and co-opted. I tend to try and avoid it now or use it in very specific cases. And one of the reasons is why it's kind of become ineffective, aside from Trump taking it over and sort of molding it in the way he wants it to appear and to sound. It's also a very complex issue. So we're going to talk about the different types of online misinformation, what caused it to spread, what's driving it, who's creating it. We're going to talk a little bit about algorithms, and frankly, there's a business model for misinformation now. And those two factors have really been very different elements that have been introduced over recent years. We've always had misinformation, but you throw those two things in and things start to change a little bit. And then finally, I have a few thoughts on what I think communicators can do to help push back, and certainly look forward to your questions and any comments and insights that you folks can add to that as well. All right, so in terms of where we're going to start, again, it's kind of looking at that element of the different types of misinformation. So this is a great graphic that was done by an organization called First Draft, which specializes in kind of researching and training in this area. And rather than necessarily you sitting there and memorizing all of these different types of myths and disinformation, one thing is to note is that being precise in how we're describing things is probably a good thing and something hopefully all of you can relate to as communicators. And then the second part is understanding how things that are not in any way intended to mislead people can often be swept up and shared and given new context that do mislead. So, for example, when we look at the far left over there, one type is satire or parody. This is meant to be social commentary. This is meant to be humorous. But a lot of times people misinterpret it. It gets shared and it starts to spread and people get confused. And then at the complete other end there, we have fabricated content, 100% false, designed to deceive and do harm. And this is where originally for me, when I started kind of writing and using the term fake news back in 2014, this was the kind of stuff that I was applying the label to, 100% false, intended to deceive. And then on top of that, it was also created for money. And that's the business model piece we'll talk about here. I think when something is false and intended to deceive but has ideological or political reasons, propaganda is a good term for that. We've had it for a long time. But what you can see here is, we have a complex issue. We have, sometimes real information gets misinterpreted or deliberately, misinterpreted, and that can sort of set off a chain reaction. So understanding and recalling that complexity and trying to be precise in what we're describing and why it's problematic is I think, a really good and important thing. So to give you a kind of example of what I mean by that, there we go. Oops, sorry. So this example here, I'll go back to, sorry, I'm just trying to get back. Could you guys help me get back to the slide before this? For some reason, the arrows are not working so well for me.
Yeah, did that get you there? That's the first draft, the 7 types of disinformation?
It's looking for slide 9.
Oh, slide 9. Okay, no problem. There we go.
Okay, so what we see here is this photo, and people may recall it actually from Hurricane Sandy, perhaps. Amazing photo, amazing image, not real. And what happened actually is, you have a real photo of the Statue of Liberty, and then you've got this amazing cloud around it. The cloud is from a storm that had happened years before in Iowa. And so somebody takes that and they combine them and we get this. But what's really notable here is, I put this example up not to shame this particular guy, but this is just an average guy who saw this image, who thought it was incredible and shared it. And when you look at what his comment was, he says, this is an amazing shot of New York today with the Frankenstorm bearing down. Nature is so powerful yet so beautiful. Now, a lot of people, I think, could really relate to that emotion and his connection to that image. And that's probably why it went so insanely viral. When I took this screenshot, it had been shared almost 300,000 times. Now, his intention here was not to mislead anyone, and the arrow there is pointing to him posting a comment later on, realizing that, okay, wait a second. So he writes, apparently this pic has gone viral from my wall with 99,989 shares. So that's 200,000 shares ago. He realizes, I've got a bit of a problem here. And so he says, I called the person who texted the photo to me, and then she called her friend who sent it to her and is in New York and told her that it is fake. So in this case, it's sent from a few people. He gets it. He thinks it's real. He shares it, has a very relatable reaction. And that's basically, your core elements for virality right there. And that certainly was not his intention in any way, shape, or form. He was really trying to just share a genuine emotion during a really, concerning time, Hurricane Sandy. So this is someone who has good motivations but ends up sharing something that's not true. This next example here are people who are absolutely aware of what they're doing, who are consciously creating stuff and trying to make it go viral as a way to really kind of muddy the waters and trick people. And so we've got 2 people here when the Podesta emails were leaked who basically decided that references to food in these emails were actually references to child sex trafficking. And these kinds of tweets were the kinds of things that helped get that Pizzagate conspiracy theory moving. So you can see here different motivations, but in the end, people being fooled, people being tricked. And so that's important to keep in mind. Now, this is also it's a global problem here, and this is one of the things that we have realized as we have been doing our reporting at BuzzFeed. We have people are always surprised. We have more than 300 journalists around the world. We do lots of fun videos and entertainment content, and there are more people doing that within the organization than in news. But we do have a news organization that is there around the world. And is working to kind of try and uncover this stuff. And so what we've been finding is, we look at Germany, we look at other countries, and what we find is that wherever we go, a lot of these things are happening there as well. And so our teams around the world in countries like Japan, Germany, France, in the UK. You can pretty much go anywhere and you can find examples of people consciously creating and spreading misinformation, of, in breaking news events, people intentionally or accidentally spreading information that isn't so credible. And so we have a problem that because the internet is global, because information is flowing globally, we have a problem that is global. And that's the reality that we're all trying to kind of deal with and grapple with right now. And for us at BuzzFeed, we've made this a priority to try and hunt down these stories, to try and understand this stuff, and to really treat the internet seriously in terms of a place where we're finding stories, we're reporting stories, but also trying to get people, to understand that this stuff has an effect in real life. And I think the place that comes to mind right away for that on the global scale is Myanmar, where the internet is relatively new there, and for most people in Myanmar, many people have phones now, but really when it comes to connecting on the internet and interacting with people, it's really all about Facebook. And so what we've seen there is the weaponization of Facebook groups and other elements to spread false information, to really whip up a lot of to incite hatred, particularly against the Muslim minority there, and we've seen, real-world consequences for that. So this is something that we're seeing play out around the world for sure. I just want to check, are you guys seeing slide 17? I have a feeling my system is being a little bit slow here, and I just want to make sure that's what everybody's seeing.
Yeah, Craig, we are seeing 17, so I think it just might be a slow internet connectivity. Okay,
great. So this is an important element here, the element of polarization and bias. And in particular, the element of political polarization is pretty big in the United States right now. We see it in other countries as well, but it's definitely a big factor. And human bias, I mentioned off the top that we've always had misinformation. And part of that is the way humans are, the way we interact with each other, the way we process information and share information. And I think, one of the things that really drove home for me kind of what's going on and how easy it is now for people to kind of be tricked and fooled online were these two Canadian teenagers that I wrote about back in, the late summer of 2016. They had been running a bunch of websites that I described as fake news and still would. Their stories were 100% made up. It was all just, to trick people and fool people. And they were doing it to make money. For them, it was, a way of really just kind of a hustle for them to do online. And again, they were teenagers. So I asked them, what makes for a good fake news story? And really one of them just said, you tell people what they want to hear. And they found that people were willing to share and believe stuff on the internet. And the key for them was, they were playing to people's bias in a lot of ways. One of the things that they found worked really well on their websites was a combination of Justin Trudeau, so the relatively surprisingly popular Prime Minister of Canada. I say that as a Canadian. We're not used to having our Prime Ministers get such attention. And then they would combine him with stories about marijuana. So it was, Justin Trudeau is opening weed stores. Justin Trudeau caught smoking weed. And on and on and on and on. So they realized that let's just give people what they want and what people want to hear. Now, in terms of the polarization piece, this is, again, I said, a really big factor in the United States. A lot of the data that we're seeing there from Pew and from other things shows that, of course, there's always been, people to the right and people to the left. There have been Democrats and Republicans and independents and other smaller parties. But what's been happening over, recent years and the last decade or two is that middle ground where, people might switch between parties or people might, consider and interact with people from another party, it's starting to collapse a little bit. What we're starting to see is not only are people, I'm a hardcore Democrat, but, their view of the people on the other side is not just kind of disagreement, but it's actual suspicion bordering into, much more aggressive feelings. And so that's a really ripe environment if you want to feed that bias, if you want to give people the information that aligns with what they already believe. And many, many decades of research into rumors and psychology and other areas has found that people are more inclined to accept and believe information that aligns with their pre-existing beliefs, and not only with deeply held beliefs, but also just kind of information that we've already received. If the new information we get aligns with it, we tend to trust that and believe it a little bit more. And so that, again, is something that can really be exploited in this environment. And what we see happening here, and this is a kind of network graph that was created by Jonathan Albright, who is a wonderful researcher now with the Tao Center at Columbia, where he kind of mapped out these ecosystems of right and left websites and tried to see what their interlinking patterns were. And what we see here, this image, we see really strong networks of conservative websites in red. The blue is the more liberal or Democrat ones. And we do see in the middle, your classic kind of large media outlets, in some cases the New York Times or what have you. And when I look at this, what I see is basically, what we have today are propagation networks that enable you to kind of get a message out and to push it out across many websites, many Facebook pages, many Twitter accounts. And at a certain point, there is a connection between repetition and belief. And the more that people see things and are told the same thing, the more that they become inclined to believe it. And the good news is that a lot of the research we're seeing right now tells us that actually filter bubbles are maybe not as bad as we thought they were at this point. We have a much more open and democratic media environment. Anybody can publish, really. And that has resulted in people reading from more sources. But of course, we're always kind of concerned, are they only consuming information from sources that align with a certain point of view or what have you? And when that happens, what you end up getting is a really fertile environment where, the president can, at a press conference, his only press conference to date, stand up and declare CNN and other outlets completely fake news. And of course, he's been doing that for more than a year now, and I think he's become, frankly, quite effective with it because he's got this network, this propagation network of places that are very closely aligned with him, and that whatever he says, they're going to push that out as well. And this is kind of a lot of what we're seeing today, where people are utilizing these networks to get messages out, and in many cases, they're feeding on polarization, they're feeding on bias, and are being quite successful with it. So I just want to check in quickly here. Any questions that we want to dive into right off the bat?
Yeah, Craig, I'll start with, if I can take the privilege as a moderator. Why in 2014 did this phenomenon sort of catch your attention, and how far back does this go? Is this back to the early days of the Internet, or is this a fairly recent phenomenon?
Yeah, so for me, it actually, so before I was doing all of this, I spent a long time running a blog that was really looking at media mistakes and corrections. And so I've been interested in sort of verification and journalists trying to get it right for a long time. But as social networks really took off in about 2010, 2011, I started to focus on, journalists before getting it right, meant like making sure you spelled your source's name correct and going to reliable sources. When so much of the news is out and by default public on social media, we need different kinds of verification skills. And so that's something that I started looking at. And then in 2014, the thing that kind of put me face to face with a lot of these, 100% false websites was I was doing a research project kind of tracking rumors and seeing how news websites covered information that was unverified and how they dealt with information that was false. And so I think one of the things that has really changed and certainly started getting traction before 2014 is one, there was of course, the rise of big social platforms and the algorithms that were deciding what people are seeing and how people play to those. Another piece is ad tech and digital advertising, where there's this business model, and I'm going to show you a couple examples of how people are making money at this in a second. But so for me, it was over time just this realization that so much of the information that we consume, of course, is not necessarily coming from professional news organizations, and that opening of the media world is, in my view, still a great thing. But we had these collision of these different things, of social platforms, of digital advertising, of also a strong growth of partisan media online. All of these things have started to come together, and I think that the 2016 election for me was just like this perfect storm of all of the elements that have been pushing this along. They all just kind of exploded at once. And so, and I don't mean to absolve journalists in this. When I did my research in 2014, I found there were a lot of news websites, credible ones, that were passing along stuff that was really, really completely dodgy, or stuff that, they clearly didn't do any of their own due diligence on. And so we play a role in this too.
Okay, Christina has a question for you. Curious what you think about the new technologies that allow for spoofing voice and videos in ways that are very hard to distinguish, whether it's fake or real. So this is talking about deep fakes, and I know you just wrote about this yesterday. Maybe you could sort of explain to people, for those who are not familiar with it, because I think it's still fairly nascent technology, not everybody's had a chance to explore this, what it is and where you see it going, and what you're worried about and what you're hopeful about.
Yeah, so the general comment on this, there's kind of a rule that the technology and tools for faking and fabricating things tend to advance faster than the ones to kind of reverse engineer it, because there's more interest in the fabrication and the faking than the detection, and there's a bigger business in it. And so one of the things that we're seeing is decent advancements being made in the ability to, for example, take a video of a politician speaking and then film someone else speaking words and then put the two together. So to take someone's mouth speaking words and then to kind of combine that with someone else's face. And yesterday BuzzFeed put out this PSA where we had the filmmaker and actor Jordan Peele reading a speech to sound like Barack Obama, and then we use these technologies where you can take these two different images, these two different series of images, and combine them into one to do a PSA about how people need to pay more attention to stuff online. And so they're calling them deep fakes. There's an element of artificial intelligence where it kind of learns how to blend these two different faces into one. That's an area. Audio manipulation is coming out as well, and so on one level, yeah, like we need to absolutely be aware and concerned about these things. The second level, having talked to some experts, is that I do think there's some good advances, fortunately, being made in automatic detection of these things. However, sometimes it just needs to be good enough. It doesn't need to be perfect, and if it's good enough, people will fall for it and they'll share it. And the dynamic we see play out over and over again is that the amount of shares for the fake thing far outstrips the amount of shares for the debunking of it. And so I do worry in that sense that even if we get pretty good at detecting these things, there's still stuff that can kind of muddy the waters and confuse people at the very least. And the reality is that there's a variety of companies and researchers working in these areas. And you may wonder, like, why are they doing that? What's the point? You can take, for example, Adobe. Adobe is working on easy, manipulation of sound. And so if, for example, you're a film editor and you need to actually, change something that an actor said, you will be able to use these technologies. You'll be able to splice their voice and audio together to say whatever you want it to say, and you'll be able to potentially, make their lips move in a different way to look like that's what they actually said. And so the use in special effects and in film and other areas is kind of what's driving this. But of course, you can't control exactly how it gets applied. And so this is where the sort of, the genie gets out of the bottle, and tons of people are using it for different motivations.
Thank you, sir. And for those who are interested in seeing that video that the folks at BuzzFeed made with Jordan Peele as the director of Get Out, it's horrifying and also a little funny, maybe not safe for work, but suffice to say, it's up on Twitter, and we've shared it with you if you want to go have a look there under the hashtag ComNetLive. Our friend Sean from Boston asks, the Boston Globe recently profiled Busta Troll, a liberal internet troll who is notorious for spreading false news online, and who says he does it to undercut the right by making fake news so pervasive that people will begin to question right-wing reporting more broadly. Wondering what your take is on this and whether you think it's working.
So I have a bit of history with Busta Troll. I think we were the first to kind of write about what he was doing a while back, and I have to tell you, I think he is one of the most completely misguided people in terms of what he's doing. But I also don't know that he's being honest about his motivations. So for everybody's benefit here, this is a guy who has long been a troll online, and one of the things he used to do was, so he's a hardcore liberal, and he used to trick people who were running Republican Facebook pages into thinking that he was a Republican, and they'd eventually give him admin access, and then he would start posting ridiculous stuff on their page. And so this was something that he was doing for a while. And then he decided to create websites that are just 100% fake. Everything on it is just made-up stories about, Hillary Clinton arrested and, marched out of her house or what have you. And what his argument is that when he posts these fake stories, it shows, who the dumb Republicans are, and then he and other people go out and kind of troll them and call them out online. The problem with this model is that his stuff actually can often go quite viral, and so it actually reaches a lot of people, and there's no way that him and the other people who are doing this can actually go in one-to-one, troll or tell each person who shares it and reads it that this is fake. And so he's kind of creating a problem, and then by only confronting a certain amount of people who are touched by it, he's arguing that he's actually helping fix it. And so I think the numbers just show that he's not having a positive effect. In fact, he's just completely creating more misinformation. And then the last thing I'd add is that he has ads on these sites, so he's making money while he's doing it. So I don't think it's an effective strategy, but I also, part of me believes that he's perhaps giving this as his explanation to justify taking the money. But he's convinced a whole bunch of people who do it with him now. So this stuff just gets out there, and people see it and share it. And I think overall he's not having the effect he claims he's trying to.
Okay, thank you. Now, Erica has a question, then we'll move on. So, Craig, what is the best way to respond to false news as an individual or as an organization? Often it seems like one wouldn't even know where to start.
Yeah. So the first thing I think is, and I have some tips at the end of this as well, in particular for responding to it. One of the things that I'll say now and reinforce again at the end is that it's the worst thing you can do mostly is to be really confrontational about it. So, you see a friend share something or a colleague or what have you. What you don't want to do is to then, call them out and say, hey, dummy, look, here, Snopes debunked this. Even if it's not something that a person is deeply connected to, the fact is if they feel shame, if they feel like they're being confronted with something, their reaction is going to be to push back. And in that moment, you lose the ability really to kind of connect with them and get them to be willing to potentially, really kind of open up and say, oh, yeah, gosh, I didn't realize that. So non-confrontational, not personal. One of the slogans that a lot of people in the skeptic community have is debunk the idea, not the person. So I think that's one piece of it. The other one I'll just add quickly now is as much as possible, do it in a kind of one-to-one scenario. Again, if this is someone that you have a relationship with, then use that and talk to them and engage with them so that it's not kind of a public calling out. So those are some of the piece of advice for actually when you see stuff being shared. The other thing I would just add quickly is, obviously you need to think about the stuff that you're engaging with and sharing and resharing. So taking that bit of extra pause and extra time, not feeling like you have to pass something on right away, waiting to see how it develops, waiting to see if other places and other people start saying the same thing. That's a good way to ensure that you accidentally don't pass unreliable stuff along.
Thank you. Shall we go ahead and move along? I guess we want to hit slide 23.
Yeah. So I've touched on this a little bit, but in this networked environment, it's really an environment where stuff spreads very quickly, and the people who are creating and spreading this stuff really know that and like to capitalize on it. And then the second piece, of course, when I talk about algorithmic filtering, what I mean by, for example, is when you open up Facebook and you look at your news feed, the combination of items that they have identified that you as a user they think you will be interested in. That's a series of algorithms that are deciding what they think you want to see. And so somebody has programmed these to say, if something is shared by a person that this other person interacts with a lot on Facebook, maybe let's show that thing because they seem to have a close connection. And so it's a set of rules that really decide, what people do or don't see. And even though it's a computer program, it of course has the bias of the creator in it. And what we've seen with Facebook is a bias around showing information that is getting a lot of engagement, a lot of likes, a lot of shares, a lot of comments. And there isn't necessarily a connection between engagement and accuracy. And so here on slide 24, this is really we went to go and see if we could get some data to kind of back this up and help understand it. So what we did was we took a group of really hyperpartisan conservative pages on Facebook, hyperpartisan liberal pages on Facebook, and we looked at the information that they were sharing, and we fact-checked all of it. So we fact-checked like something more than 1,000 posts from a bunch of different pages. And what this chart here shows is kind of the relationship between how accurate the information was and how many shares it was getting on Facebook. And if we look at the red bar, that's the red bar of content that we labeled as mostly false when we fact-checked it. And if you look at the gray bar, that's stuff that was a mixture of true and false, which was often an incorrect headline on top of body text that might have been a little more accurate. And so basically, the takeaway here, the first one, is that the more misleading or outright false you were, the more you were rewarded with shares on Facebook. So this is the algorithmic thing emphasizing the bias that the content was appealing to in people. So it was making the scenario even more effective. And then the last piece here is that you'll see some of the best engagement is for that box on the end there, the clear one. That was for content that we rated having no factual content. And what that meant was they weren't making a specific factual claim. They weren't saying, 500,000 people are homeless or what have you. It was usually took the form of an extremely partisan expression like this post if you hate Hillary Clinton. And so what we saw was, again, if you played to that bias, if you played to, to extreme emotion, you were often being rewarded by Facebook with more engagement. And so I think that, that leads to the next slide here, which actually, could you guys switch it to 25? Because I think I'm getting a little bit of a connectivity issue here that's not letting me move it over. So the next slide there, number 25, I think really kind of encapsulates this pretty well, what's going on here. The element of accuracy, how factual your information is, that can be secondary to how powerful your network is, as we sort of looked at a little bit earlier. And it's also secondary to how well packaged that information is in terms of, how good of a job are you doing appealing to anger or it can also go the other way to happiness or other things. And so, that piece of what people actually see, the quality of information, unfortunately, is not, or at least has not been a determining factor in how many people are going to see that. So the next one here is something I've alluded to a couple times about this being a profitable business now, which I do think is one of the differences that we've been experiencing over the last few years. Someone like Busta Troll, for example, can throw up a website. As long as he puts a satire label on it, he can make up whatever he wants, and he will sign up with ad networks and get money based on how much traffic he's getting. And this is by no means just him. There's lots of people who are doing that. One of the things that I found in my research here, if you look at this, this image here of two different articles using the same photo of Kellyanne Conway, one is written from the sort of hyperpartisan liberal perspective, one is written from the hyperpartisan conservative perspective. And what I found when I started looking at the domain ownership records and other things is that these two seemingly completely opposite websites are actually owned by the same person. And so we're in a scenario here, and by no means was this the only example of that. I found other individuals and companies who were kind of playing both sides. We're seeing people realize that, hey, there's a pretty good business here, and in a classic business fashion, they want to hedge their bets. So maybe they started as a committed Republican running a Republican site, but with Trump around, there's frankly a lot of liberal sites have been doing very well because now they've got an enemy. So a lot of people have gone to the other side. And what you also see here, of course, is that these headlines were completely false. She wasn't kicked out of the White House. She's still there today. And so, so we see this mixture, and we see a financial motivation for putting this kind of stuff out there. We also see that in the next example here, slide 28, with, you read this headline, you can probably tell that this headline was not written by someone with very good English. And in this case, they've just kind of made up a quote and attributed it to Clint Eastwood, and they put it on Facebook. And the thing that is really kind of important here is when you see this show up in your news feed, it's a picture of Clint Eastwood, it's a headline, it looks the same as if the New York Times had kind of done an interview with Clint Eastwood. The social networks wrap the content in kind of the same way. It has almost a flattening effect whereby everything looks to a certain degree the same. And in this case, a young guy in Kosovo who's running a site where he just makes stuff up all the time is able to look kind of like the New York Times or another place. And that element is really a big advantage to him and potentially a big disadvantage to other places. So we see what it looks like on Facebook. Then on the next slide here, we can see, if people actually click through to it, this is what you got. So what do we see here? We see a headline, and then we see the words yes and no, which aren't even really a poll. So it's basically just a headline with a fake poll, and then to highlight that content there. Everything else around that is an ad. So this is people often refer to this kind of a site as an ad farm, because basically they've done the minimal amount of work and effort to put content on it, and it's really just about getting people to click through from Facebook so that they're going to see these ads and hopefully click on them. And so this is an example of really it's kind of arbitrage in a certain way of leveraging the bias of people and the algorithms of Facebook to get folks onto the page so you can show them ads. And this is something that we see all over the place. There was a question about Busta Troll earlier, and one of the things that actually we found in writing about his sites was that he would make up one of his fake stories, he would publish it, and then because it was performing well on Facebook, you would have tons of people in Macedonia, in Kosovo, and other countries running these really shoddy American politics sites just copy and paste his article. And so we did like a little case study where we saw it was something like more than 20 other websites within a short amount of time had just copy and pasted his completely fake article, and off it went to reach lots of people, and in a context where there was no weak disclosure of satire or anything like that. It just looked like a real thing. And so next one here is sort of the last one, slide 31. If you guys could flip that for me, because it looks like it's not letting me do it again. This is a really overarching point that I think is important for everybody to remember, that this, because of a lot of the great things that have happened in this media environment, more open, more democratic, ability for far more people to play. You don't need to be, a big corporation with huge printing presses and all these things. These are all great advantages for the, advancement of freedom of expression. It also, it levels the playing field, and it creates a scenario where folks like, the guy in Kosovo can put out content and make it look pretty similar to stuff from professionally produced content. And that in some way it seems like a level playing field, but it also tilts it at the same time, because people who realize that can really exploit it, can really manipulate it. And so there's, we've looked at kind of that content example on Facebook. People talk a lot about bots on Twitter, and there are lots of bots on Twitter. A very significant portion of Twitter's user base is not made up of humans using a single account. There's no question about that, and Twitter admits it. But I think there's also a lot of misinformation, frankly, about bots. And this is a story done by a colleague of mine where he showed that far from, all of the bots or trolls on Twitter being run out of Russia, there were also Americans who were running networks of bots that were pushing pro-Trump information. And so we have a lot of people who understand how to manipulate this environment, who understand how to game the system, and they get in, and if they have the right skills, they can often be quite effective as well. And on the next slide here, on 33, you can see some examples of a really crude kind of botnet, similar messaging, similar kinds of accounts, just pumping it out. And in a lot of cases, what they, in some cases, what they want to do is be able to, pump out tons and tons of tweets, all with the same hashtag, for example, to try and force that hashtag to trend on Twitter. So we see things like that happening a lot. And just one general caution I would give you about that is you need to operate with a higher degree of skepticism in this environment. And so when you see stuff trend, when you see a post with tons of likes or comments, you need to be a little bit cautious, because it's very easy to fabricate and purchase all of these things. You can buy Twitter followers, you can buy retweets, you can buy likes, you can buy friends, you can buy members for your group. All of these things are possible and very cheap and very easy to grab. And so, this is a quote from that botnet master, Microchip, and this is a piece where he's talking about journalists about generating this stuff to kind of occupy the attention of journalists, and how he thinks it's ridiculous that they keep falling for it. I think it's also relevant for communicators as well. There's a lot of times where folks like them will try to take a well-known brand or well-known organization and kind of wrap them in to an issue so that a boycott happens or something like that. And if these journalists are getting targeted, I do think more and more brands and organizations and prominent people are getting targeted and tried to be turned into political footballs. And it's possible that the organization you work at might end up in that position one day. And the more that you're able to kind of recognize that, wait a second, all of the accounts sending us this email, all of the accounts tweeting at us seem to be using the exact same messaging, that kind of thing. So it's a new version of astroturfing in a lot of ways. So in that scenario, what can we do? And I don't pretend to have all the answers. I think it is, hopefully one of the things that's come across in this is that it is a very complex problem and a complex issue. I don't think there's any one solution. But some of the things that I wanted to kind of highlight and suggest that you think about as communicators, points that you can take away from this. There's a few that I put here for you. So, one of the things is just listening to this information, and hopefully it's useful and gives you some context on what's going on there, understanding these dynamics, and kind of sharing that information and making others aware of it in your organization, I think is important. I think on the most basic level, just recognizing this stuff, being aware of this changing environment is a really good first step. The second thing is thinking about the knowledge you have, the expertise you have. When there is something that is where misinformation is kicking up about a particular issue, and that's where your domain expertise is, where are you possibly able to intervene and to provide some important information to back up what is actually accurate, rather than letting people who are spreading misinformation take over. So thinking about that piece, and I think being focused on that and not kind of willy-nilly about it, but really trying to think where can we add the most value is important. I talked about a couple of pieces of advice before, not shaming people, debunking the idea, and not the person. Another couple of just quick tips on interventions here. One of the most fundamental things is that when you are in the act of trying to knock down misinformation, as much as possible in your communications around it, don't repeat the falsehood. So you want to express what is true more than you want to talk about what is false. So make it clear what you're talking about. Hey, we've seen some claims about X going around. We want to make it clear that and then from there you don't go back to the false claim. You want to keep reinforcing what is accurate with people because, as we talked about before, repetition and belief, there is a connection there. Visual stuff is really important for particularly for social networks. Images and memes are far more powerful than sharing a link to an article. When we did that analysis of the hyperpartisan Facebook pages, that's what we saw the most viral content was. It was memes and images and videos. And so keep that in mind as you're trying to kind of create communications to put out there. And I do encourage you, when it's not a really serious scenario, when you feel like you can strike the right tone, humor and playfulness and ways of really getting your message across, and also ways of showing you don't take yourself too seriously, these can be effective. But again, if it's a serious scenario, you don't want to step wrong on that, and I think you folks probably have a good sense of that balance as well. And then, just to reinforce that point I made recently about microchip is that, sometimes you're going to be a target. That is the reality of it. It may come unexpectedly, but just try to, in the midst of the storm, try to look and say, all right, where is this actually coming from? How much of this is real? How much of this is orchestrated? How many of these tweets and complaints seem to all be coming back from one particular place? Thinking about that, thinking about what is the network of kind of complaint that's happening here is a good way to try and think, do we actually have a massive public outcry about this, or do we actually have a manufactured scandal where people are trying to get us, trying to bait us into saying something? So last, just kind of recap here for everyone. In terms of key takeaways, some of the things that I would emphasize. Again, it's a complex global problem, and always remember that piece about people acting with different motivations. Well-meaning people have shared a lot of terrible things online, and they will continue to do so. And so that's an important thing to always keep in mind. This media environment, which is so much more democratized, which has so much opportunity, it does open the door to more manipulation, to more deception, and it is happening in pretty much any area you can think of. So being aware of that and thinking about that, I think, is an important thing. When we think about the factors of what's creating and spreading this stuff, intense partisanship, those elements of algorithmic filtering, the advertising world, the business model for this, really important. But at the end of the day, it's human nature. It is, us wanting to believe things that align with beliefs and knowledge we already have. It is us choosing a side and then not being willing to move from that. It is us in moments where there's a lot of uncertainty and where we don't have all of the information, a natural disaster or breaking news. It is us naturally trying to make sense of that and fill in the gaps, which causes us to seek out information and share it that may not be so reliable. So human nature is really important in all of this. We can't just think about the kind of technology and media stuff. And then the last thing that I absolutely believe strongly, and it's especially true for people who are professional communicators, is that we all have a role to play in helping fight back against this stuff, and also in spreading accurate information. It's not just about wagging our finger at the false stuff. It's also about thinking about how we make good, credible information as appealing and as attractive as the stuff that people are making up and pushing out there. So with that, I really appreciate your time and your attention. I would love to take some more questions if there's more, and comments as well.
Thank you, Craig. This was hugely helpful and just extraordinary. We have a number of questions. Why don't we get to them? Lois first asks, it seems as though reinstating the Fairness Doctrine would be an obvious solution to this problem, so not just regulating social media, but going back to an expectation that public airways are not used as propaganda machines of any kind. Do you think there's any kind of push to reinstate this?
Right. So, I mean, to answer the key piece of the question quickly, I would say I don't see any appetite or any kind of push to reinstate the Fairness Doctrine, and that was done away with some time ago, and I think as much as the Fairness Doctrine does kind of cause and require TV stations, for example, to think about are we giving fair airtime to different points of view. One of the downsides of it that journalists are talking a little bit about more these days is that it created this type of journalism which was sometimes very wishy-washy, and sometimes there actually is a right answer to something, and it created this world where journalists felt they were doing their job, where on every story they went, and here's somebody from one side, here's somebody from another, I'll dust off my hands and off I go, rather than actually trying to help people understand things and actually help guide them to say, well, there's conflicting views on this, here's the best data we have available. So unfortunately, it's kind of like, and maybe it sounds like a cop-out, there's no perfect solution to anything. I think there were some problems with the Fairness Doctrine, but I also think right now we're all trying to figure out how do we create an environment where the worst actors are not incentivized and performing as well as they are right now. And I think there are also a lot of people who are very frustrated with how partisan and how nasty the media environment has become. So I don't see the Fairness Doctrine coming back. I think one of the big things that's happening right now is the social networks, Facebook, Twitter, and also big platforms like Google are really thinking more about, what is acceptable on our platform and what isn't. They had this, I think in some ways, naive view that, listen, sure, we have some rules, no porn, no hate speech and all that, but they weren't really doing what was required to enforce them at the scale that they operate. And now they're trying to figure that out. And so they're taking more responsibility, which is good. But of course, the downside potentially is censorship. And so I think we have to watch very carefully what they're doing. But I suspect, over the coming years, we're going to see them exercising more control over that. And one of the reasons is they don't want something like a Fairness Doctrine being applied to them. They don't want more regulation. So we'll see what they can come up with.
Okay, and our friend Rebecca from Denver asks, Is there a systemic response for which we should be advocating as a field? So if it's not the Fairness Doctrine, is there some other sort of silver bullet or overarching response that we should be getting behind and pushing for?
I think one piece is more accountability from these huge and incredibly powerful platforms. And I think that pushback has been pretty successful over the last year and a half. But then we also have to hold them accountable and not just say, "Can you guys go out and fix this," and not see what they're silencing and suppressing. So that piece of demanding more from these tools and companies that we use and that we interact with. Another one, I do think for folks in your field, there's a lot of effort being made in news literacy and media literacy areas, and we do have a challenge here of educating all of us, not just younger generations, but all of us are struggling, I think, with this kind of new media environment. So I think one thing for folks with your areas of expertise is to think about how, in your community and as a profession, how can you support good quality education and resources for everyone, so they're able to feel a little more comfortable in this information environment. So they take on that additional responsibility that we all have to really think about what we're seeing, to investigate it a little bit more. I think that if we can figure out ways of getting that to happen on a really broad basis, can be quite effective, and it seems like a good area for folks in the communications profession to think about. And in terms of where is that happening? Well, universities and other schools are looking at this kind of stuff. You may see people involved locally. Libraries are getting involved in this as well. They may have programs they're looking for people to help out with. So I think if you look, locally and nationally, there's a lot of initiatives that perhaps you folks can get behind as well.
So a factoid and then a question from me. Our friends at The Atlantic magazine have been looking at this, and they, to your point about people sharing without necessarily thinking, they found that their best estimation is about 60% of the material that gets shared across the social web, 60% is what they call a blind share. So we never clicked through, you never read the piece, you didn't even get into the lead. You literally saw the headline, clicked like, or more likely share, and off it goes. What do you make of that? Does that sound right to you? 60% of what we're seeing on the web, your friends, your grandma, your crazy Uncle Larry sends to you, they didn't actually even bother to click and read it themselves. And what does that say about news literacy?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it doesn't strike me as an outrageous number. And I say this as somebody who, of course, writes articles for a living. There's lots of times where I get, people, reacting to something I've written when they clearly have not read it. And there's no question that there are times where people share things. And I certainly admit there's times where I do it where, I'll share something and I haven't read it, but, I trust the person and the outlet and that kind of thing. So yes, I think it's happening a lot. And one of the driving factors behind that is there's a performance element to this kind of sharing and communication on social networks. We're really trying to create and portray an image about ourselves by the kinds of content that we are creating and sharing on it. So, people who really are spending time picking out that perfect Instagram shot, picking that family shot to represent, what they've been doing, there is an element of, and I don't mean this in a really negative way, there's an element of kind of performance and portrayal of that. And so it's the same thing when we're sharing information. We want to share articles and information that presents the image of ourselves that we want to see. And so people if the headline works for somebody, sure, in that scenario, they don't necessarily need to read it. They just want to be seen that they've shared it. And so I think it's kind of it's not a completely new phenomenon. It's a little bit easier to do that now, but, people might, I think, decades ago, perhaps they brought certain magazines or books with them when they were taking the subway or the bus to work, and they wanted people to see them reading that. And while they may have been reading it for real, there's also times where I think people were really consciously thinking about what they want to be seen, sharing, and reading, and it's a behavior that is kind of on steroids now.
Are you telling me I'm not really reading The Economist on the Metro? I'm just kidding. Hey, listen, so as a final question, I'm going to take the privilege. Mark Zuckerberg, I'm sure many of us saw this, made the rounds on Capitol Hill last week. He testified on both the House and the Senate side. Did you get a chance to watch and cover any of that? And if so, what did you hear, what did you learn that caught your attention and that you think we should be paying attention to?
Well, a couple of thoughts come to mind. So one is, people were very hard on the senators for the seemingly dumb questions they asked, but I do think we need to remember that to a certain extent, even though they were brief and should have had very, good and poignant questions, it does reinforce how little I think a lot of us understand about these tools and products that we use every single day. So that was one of the things that stood out to me. The second thing is that, frankly, when it came to questions about Facebook gathering information about people who aren't even using Facebook, how Facebook gathers and monetizes data, I found him to be really evasive and at times say things that were inaccurate. And so that piece, what it said to me is that Facebook is kind of uncomfortable with its own level of data collection and that kind of thing. And so that stood out to me as one thing. Overall, since I'm talking to a bunch of communicators here, I think he performed in a lot of the ways I would have expected, which is that he was very buttoned down. He had sort of canned and home-based responses that he would turn to when challenged on things. And so at the end of the day, while I think it was an important piece of accountability, the truth is I didn't expect to learn a huge amount. I think it was a piece of kind of performance that, one, Congress and the Senate wanted him there and wanted to show that they were holding him accountable. And two, for him to also do that to show that he is accountable. And probably both parties feel like they achieved their goal. The big question is what, if anything, happens now? And I still don't see a huge appetite for legislation in the United States. And so it will be interesting to see if there's anything else that may come along to kind of change that. But with all of this outcry, I don't know that there's going to be new legislation. And that was sort of one of my takeaways from it, that I don't know how much changes as a result of his appearance.
All right, so having read your piece, and I actually did read it about the deep fakes that you posted yesterday, and I encourage you all to take a look at that. A final note or final question for you. Are you feeling hopeful and optimistic, or pessimistic and concerned as we head out into, I guess it's going to be an election season in the not too distant future?
I'm gonna cop out and say I'm hopeful yet concerned. So I'm going to take a little bit from basket A and a little bit from basket B. So the piece that makes me hopeful is that people are actually paying attention to this issue now, and not just in a kind of passive way. We've got technologists and academics and politicians and a whole wide range of people in society who are really worried about this and looking at this and now working on it. So that awareness gives me hope that, because like 2 years ago, we didn't have that yet. And sure, things went kind of nuts before us having the realization, but that's the piece that makes me hopeful. One of the things that concerns me is, do we just kind of get tired of this and it moves away from the broader public conversation and potentially gets worse because we lose our motivation for it? But yeah, and in general, I'm just concerned because overall the adversary in a lot of these ways, they're very motivated, they can often be well-financed, and they're always looking for new ways. And so it's just a scenario where I feel like this is the new normal. We have to have constant diligence. We have to figure out better accountability structures, and we do have to really get our society aware of this vastly different media environment. So there's things that definitely still concern me, but I'm really happy that there's a will and there's an interest, and even in a scenario like this where lots of folks want to come and talk about this issue, and you guys will leave, and it will be in the back of your mind, and maybe one day you'll have an opportunity to apply some of this, and that's a good thing.
All right, Craig, that's a hopeful note to leave on. Thank you very, very much for giving us so much of your time and for sharing Celine Dion on the way out. For everybody else, thank you so much for joining us for this hour. I've certainly learned a whole hell of a lot. And if you're not following Craig, please do. He is an incredible resource. And as you are signing off, would you please take a survey that pops up, because we want to get your feedback in order to get better. And we will be back in just a few weeks' time. I told you the Atlantic, they estimate 60% of the material that's shared across the social web is a blind share. Folks don't even bother to click through, let alone read it. But we're going to be talking with them about something else, which is resurfacing content. It turns out about 57% of the content that is read online from the Atlantic is not content that was produced within that month. It came from their archives. So we're going to talk about resurfacing and what that means and what that might mean for your organization. That's going to be in the early part of May. Take a look out for an invitation for that very, very soon. In the meantime, on behalf of everybody from the network, Craig, thank you so much. Really appreciate all the incredible work you're doing. Incredibly grateful to help us all think through a very complex and fast-moving issue. Much obliged. Be well, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Please stand by.